Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Buckley Institute's 2024 Annual Conference. I am Jack Batten, a sophomore studying classics and events director of the Buckley program. I will be moderating our panel discussion on the 21st century free speech crisis in American colleges. This topic is of particular importance because of Yale's recent adoption of new public comment guidelines, which you probably all just heard Dean Lewis talk about earlier. Organizations like FIRE have characterized Yale's new guidelines as an important step toward institutional neutrality, with Yale's FIRE free speech rating vastly improved over last year's. As our staff at the Buckley Beacon recently pointed out, Yale not only made one of the largest jumps in the rankings, moving from 234th to 155th, but also outperformed its Ivy League peers, with the next highest being Cornell, ranked 215th. Yet critics have pointed to the inclusion of several loopholes, allowing Yale to comment on, quote, nonpartisan issues. As President McInnes said in a recent email to the Yale community, it may be appropriate, and in some cases necessary, for leaders to speak when matters directly implicate the university's core mission, values, functions, or interests, or to express empathy on external matters of transcendent importance to the community. Now, what exactly one is allowed to say or not say at Yale still very much remains an open question. Allow me to introduce our panelists, who are uniquely qualified to address the issue of campus free speech. Nicholas Christakis is Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University, where he works in the fields of network and biosocial science. He directs the Human Nature Lab and is co-director of the Yale Institute for Network Science. He was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2006, the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2010, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2017, and the National Academy of Sciences in 2024. Dr. Christakis is the author of over 220 articles and several books, including Connected, The Surprising Power of Our Social Networks and How They Shape Our Lives, and Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, which was a New York Times bestseller. In 2009, Dr. Christakis was named by Time to their annual list of the 100 most influential people in the world. Keith Whittington is the David Boies Professor at Yale Law School, the founding chair of the Academic Freedom Alliance, and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is the faculty director of the Center for the Study of Free Speech and Academic Freedom at Yale Law School. He works on American constitutional history, politics, and law, and on American political thought. He's the author of You Can't Teach That, The Battle Over University Classrooms, and Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech, among other works. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and served on the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Texas at Austin and completed his PhD in political science at Yale University. Alex Morey leads FIRE's campus advocacy teams in their work defending student and faculty rights on America's college campuses. An attorney, journalist, and former Peace Corps volunteer, Alex's approach to campus advocacy integrates trusted legal strategy, public interest reporting, and the power of human connection. Her analysis is frequently featured by media outlets like the New York Times, the BBC, CNN, NPR, and the Wall Street Journal. She regularly speaks at events nationwide, engaging and educating audiences on emerging campus rights issues. Alex is a member of the First Amendment Lawyers Association and is licensed to practice law in New York, the District of Columbia, and Wisconsin. And we'll begin with brief opening remarks from each of our guests, starting with Dr. Christakis.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm really honored to be on this panel with two people I admire and respect so much, especially for the work that they've been doing. Actually, I should say three people. I just met you. Young Jack. I was trying to think of something different I might say about free expression and free expression at Yale than has been said by so many people and for so long. And I suspect many of the people in this audience have been thinking about these issues, paying attention to them, and so on, including the recent issues surrounding institutional neutrality. For what it's worth, I was not so impressed with the policy that Yale promulgated. And I decided what I'd like to put on the table is slightly askance or slightly askew. And it has to do with an old idea from J.S. Mill about how free speech allows us to see what people really think. In other words, there's a connection between free expression and honesty. Because when you don't have a culture of free expression, people start to lie. And you don't know what is happening. You lose the ability to see what people really think if you clamp down. Now, the one advantage that Mill identified and that Fire often emphasizes of having free expression is at least you get to know who the people with the ostensibly odious views are, and you maybe could avoid them, for example, if you create an open community. And this is in turn related to an issue having to do with totalitarianism, which is an idea which is an old idea. I'm not the originator of this idea, but it's a very interesting idea to me, which is that one of the things that distinguishes totalitarian states or totalitarian regimes or totalitarian policies, although it's very strong to say that Yale has totalitarian policies, but they can be inflected in that direction, is not that what a totalitarian, it's not the truths that the totalitarian policy prevents you from expressing. It's the lies that the totalitarian policy obliges you to express. Right? I really show mastery over you, not if I silence you from saying what you want to say or what's true, but if I compel you to say something you know to be a lie, right? That's like a real kind of power that I've exercised over you. And so I think in many ways, and this has struck me for years now, Yale is not honest with itself. We don't have as much looks at veritas as we should have, and we lie to ourselves. And many of the examples at present relate to identitarianism, but not all of them do. So let me give you some examples of how Yale is not honest with itself. It's not possible, mathematically speaking, to maximize two variables at the same time, such as diversity and excellence, unless they overlap perfectly. It's not possible to have both excellence and diversity, unless they're the same thing. Otherwise, as soon as you start maximizing in one dimension, this is differential calculus. Anyone who took, raise your hands if you took Math 120 at Yale. You learn this, it's mathematically not possible. So to be repeatedly told that you can maximize both is a lie. You cannot maximize both at the same time. One will have to yield to the other. The fact that we've had roughly the same percentage of Asian students admitted for 20 years is not a coincidence, right? It's not the case that by dumb luck we've had approximately 16% Asian students year after year after year for 20 years. That did not happen by chance. It would be a lie to say that that is just how the chips fell out. The episode with Trent Colbert at the Yale Law School was appalling. I mean, it was like a forced confession. And there was no, Yale has not apologized for this. There has been no public accounting. We've had no truth or reconciliation committee. These things keep happening at Yale because we never actually are honest with ourselves about what happened and why did it happen and what could we do to be better about it. We don't do that. We are not honest with ourselves about what happened. That it's any person looking at that, like, nice career you've got there. Well, hey, if something should happen to it, why don't you sign this confession, this apology that we've pre-written for you is just embarrassing beyond belief. And here's another example, now a little bit inflected in the other political direction. I don't think camping out on a campus is in and of itself a violation of anyone's rights. I actually think that the encampments are free speech. I don't have a problem with the encampments. I don't have a problem with art installations. I don't have a problem with the bookshelves that were put out. The problem I have, and I said it at the time, is when you stop the free movement of people through the campus, especially if you pick on them because they look Jewish or something, right? That is a problem. You have no right to stop your fellow students from transiting wherever they want on the campus. The tents themselves are not a problem as far as I'm concerned. Okay, here's some that are not politically as inflected. Not everyone is an A student. So we have, we are supposed to believe that everyone is an A student, and that's why we have like the median grade at Yale is an A, right? The median. And in fact, I think 80 or 85% are A minus or higher. It's ridiculous. And we need to be honest with ourselves and with our students that you're not all A students. Here's another one. Yale is falling in the national rankings year after year. We have to be honest with ourselves. Most of our generation was Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Then we kind of grudgingly let Stanford and MIT enter the list. But actually, we're falling we're like 9th, 10th, like Johns Hopkins exceeds us in the rankings in some rankings. University of Chicago, which is my favorite university in this country, exceeds us in the rankings. We have to be honest with ourselves about this if we're going to actually do anything about it. We can't just, rely on our legacy credentials and just sort of sweep it under the carpet. Here's another one. the reason for the growth and the bureaucracy is not solely compliance with external mandates. There's the growth, the Yale faculty, I don't know if you guys know this, Yale faculty hasn't grown much at all in the last 20 years, but we have like more than 1,000 new full-time equivalent human beings, 1,000 people who earn, you compute the median salary, pick a number, 100 grand, 80 grand, you pick a number and multiply that by 1,000. And you get what? $80 million a year being spent on additional human beings year after year after year. And people will want you to believe that the reason for that is that we are now being regulated to death and are complying with external mandates, but I don't think that's the reason, and they never release the data to support that reason because we are not honest with ourselves. We don't say, let's discuss this and actually put some data on the table transparently and see why this is happening at our institution, and is it legitimate, is it not? Let's talk about it. And last well, this is not the strongest example, but it is one example, has to do with our relationship with China. Yale has had a long and wonderful, commendable relationship with China. We're one of the first Ivy League schools to have a footprint in China. But I don't think our contemporary relationship with China is properly thought through. And I don't think we're as honest about it as we should be, or about the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on our campus. And I recognize we can't ignore China. I don't think we should ignore China. I think we need to engage with China and so on. But I also think we need to be honest about what we're doing. Anyway, so I guess the idea that I would put on the table related to free expression is its relationship and its connection to the ability of human beings and a population to be honest with each other and honest about their own institution.
So that's an extremely useful framing, I think, for thinking about the value of speech activities in university context, whether what we're talking about is political speech in the public square, whether it's social media or physically in person on the quad and the like, or whether we're talking about more scholarly speech that occurs in classroom context and in research and the like. What's central to all of that kind of speech activity in universities is you want to make space for people to tell the truth as they see it. And you want to encourage people to get on the table their ideas, their beliefs, their arguments and evidence on behalf of those ideas, and not artificially constrain what it is we're able to hear, not to put a thumb on the scale in order to weigh arguments on one side or another in a way that's not going to allow us ultimately to try to get as best we can toward the truth. And we need to hear from other people and get their honest opinions in order to try to make our way toward the truth. And that comes faces real challenges, both from concerns about suppressing speech, but as Nick emphasizes, also on occasion being forced to say things that you simply don't believe. And I think universities do, in fact, have a genuine problem on that sort of dimension of beliefs that are frequently stated, but not very widely actually held or believed, or in fact can be easily justified. But they are taken off the table and aren't discussed. I do want to raise a couple of issues that I think are probably more familiar in some ways than the framing just mentioned, but just to sort of get some stuff on the table to begin conversations. We are in a moment that is both, I think, extremely challenging for higher education and for free speech on college campuses, but also holds some real opportunities and promise for trying to make things better. I think a lot of universities have been forced, against their will oftentimes, and kicking and screaming, to reevaluate some of their own commitments and policies in the last year or so. And in many cases, I think have developed policies that are an improvement over what they had before. And there is, I think, some real sense that's important for universities to try to turn the page on some mistaken practices and policies of the past. I don't have a great deal of confidence that that turning of the page will be completely successful and persistent and occur all at once. It will be an ongoing process, I think, to hold administrators' feet to the fire in order to actually make them live up to some of these newfound commitments and actually adhere to even well-designed policies as well as they should. But I think some lessons have in fact been learned on university campuses about the risk both internally and externally from suppressing speech and being too political as institutions. I'm happy to have some more conversation about the new institutional neutrality policy that Yale has adopted. On the whole, I'm fairly satisfied with it, although I'm sure if I was drafting it myself, it would look slightly different. But these things are drafted by committees, and you have to get people on board, and I think it's a vast improvement over what we had before, and in many ways, in fact, is a quite strong statement relative to what most universities have adopted, and is fairly close to what the University of Chicago has long embraced through its own institutional neutrality principles. I think the challenge the university will have moving forward is to what degree they actually adhere to that in practice. There'll be a constant temptation to carve out loopholes, to expand the loopholes that currently exist, to set aside those commitments, because in this case it will be really important that we say something. And so it will be important to resist those temptations and to push back when the administration falls away from them. I'll just say a couple of brief reasons why I think these kinds of institutional neutrality policies are important, and in some ways less important are policies per se than simply the adoption of the right attitudes on the part of university administrators, although in some cases they do need to be backed up by some policies that help tie some hands as well. For one, I think universities do operate in a difficult external political environment, and the more they politicize themselves and are seen as politicized, the riskier the situation is going to be for them, and the worse it's going to put them in the public eye and in the political crosshairs more generally. Universities should be looking for ways to depoliticize themselves, to back away from politics, not looking for more opportunities to engage in symbolic political actions of various sorts. And so I think given our current polarized political environment in which people are paying close attention to politics on campuses, it behooves universities, just as a matter of institutional risk, to minimize the kinds of political statements that they're issuing on an institutional basis, and try to stick to what their real core mission is, which is to support education and scholarship, not engage in institutionalized political activism. My second kind of concern, though, with these kinds of political statements being issued, and I think the rationale for adopting some form of institutional neutrality, is a real concern about mission creep in ways that will damage academic freedom in universities. If universities are able to issue institutional statements and go down a road in which they are frequently engaging in institutional political activity broadly, and we should recognize, one, that can occur across several different levels and entities within the institutional environment of the university. So we might be talking about presidential political statements, for example, but we might also be talking about departmental political statements and a variety of institutions in between. And there are real pressures on junior faculty and others within the university environment who we want to empower to be thinking and expressing themselves as freely as possible about their own honest views. But if instead we have institutional actors who have real power over the future and careers of those individuals saying, no, we've come to the conclusion as to what the right answer is on this particular question, and anyone who expresses any real doubts about that is on the wrong side of the question from our own institutional perspective. I think we're going to be forcing people into boxes where they're not willing to tell the truth, where they're constantly trying to hedge their own views and opinions in order to satisfy those who have power within institutions. And we ought to be trying to minimize the occasions in which that happens in academia rather than increasing the number of occasions in which that's happening in academia. And I think institutional neutrality is a way of helping to reduce those pressures. It certainly doesn't take them all away, but reduce those pressures in general. Just to say a word about free expression policies on campuses more generally. As I've said before, I think free expression is an important thing universities ought to make space for, although it's not the most central thing universities ought to be doing. The crucial speech we really have to protect is ultimately scholarly and educational speech. But nonetheless, universities, I think, benefit from making space available for people to engage in political activity on campuses and express political views on campuses more generally. And moreover, universities benefit in creating a more open intellectual climate by making space available for members of the campus community to be able to express themselves without fear of retaliation about their political opinions and beliefs more generally. Part of the challenge for universities is that they need to be able to simultaneously make space for that to occur while also making sure it doesn't interfere with the other activities that are occurring on campus. And some of those other activities are educational and scholarly, but there are also a variety of other activities that occur on campus. And so if you mark off a space on campus that gets occupied for weeks on end in order to have a particular form of political protest, it excludes people from being able to use that space for other purposes. Whether those other purposes are educational or scholarly, or those other purposes are for other people to engage in expressive activities in those spaces, or for those other purposes simply be recreational and other activities that people engage in on campuses. All the members of the campus community have an equal right to make use of those spaces on campus, and campuses need to be developing policies that can balance those competing interests on how the campus operates as a whole. And in doing that, you want to make ample opportunity available for people to be able to express themselves while also minimizing the kinds of conflicts that are likely to arise. I think that the kind of symbolic speech that we see in the form of protest, of encampments and tents, for example, are on their own terms not necessarily particularly problematic. They are potentially valuable aspect of symbolic speech. They convey a certain message in a particularly effective way that's not in itself problematic. The thing that's potentially concerning, though, is the knock-on effects of allowing encampments to occur. How difficult is it to remove them? How long are they going to be in place? What kinds of activities are going to occur there? As we learned quite a while ago with the Occupy Wall Street movement of a couple of decades ago, if you allow people to have long-term encampments in a particular location, there are real safety and sanitation concerns associated with those that I think the university simply can't ignore. And so having some kind of rule in place that helps provide some guidance about those kinds of activities, I think is going to be necessary at the end of the day. And again, I think the guiding principle that has to approach that is how do you develop those rules in ways that provide ample opportunities for people to express themselves while also maintaining the other purposes the university is trying to solve.
Hi, everybody. Whoa. So at FIRE, my daily job is running a team of about a dozen people. There's 100 of us at FIRE, but there's about a dozen of us who just work on campus stuff. We intake reports from students and faculty at public colleges where the First Amendment is supposed to apply, and at private ones like Yale, where y'all effectively make First Amendment-like promises, so we like to hold you to that. And these students and faculty are saying, despite these promises, despite promises like, the Woodward report saying, we believe in the right to think the unthinkable, discuss the unmentionable, challenge the unchallengeable, that's not actually playing out in practice at schools like Yale and schools all across the country. So our job is to bring that to the attention of administrators. How can we set ideal conditions for truth-seeking? That's been something that FIRE has worked on. Before we get these calls from people who say, I'm in trouble, my career's on the line, I might get expelled for something I said that was offensive or that, somebody didn't like, or I researched something, I'm a faculty member that is, goes against the grain. What are ways that we can set these ideal conditions for truth-seeking? Well, something like Woodward is really good if you can keep it, right? Like if you can actually implement that, wonderful. But one of the things we've been doing at FIRE is looking at the hard numbers, getting data. And one need not have received an A or A- in differential calculus at Yale to look at some of these numbers and make some interesting conclusions from what we see. So FIRE and College Pulse have teamed up to survey in recent years about 60,000 students at about 250 schools nationwide. Amongst them is Yale. Yale. Yale last year came in at the bottom of the pack, as Jack mentioned, around 234th out of 250, not good. They were one of our top 10 jumpers this year and are up to 155th. It's slightly below average, but we love formed upward, mobility.
What do you want?
It's an A minus.
It's an A. Everyone gets an A.
Oh boy. But some of FIRE's key findings about the continuing challenges with Yale's free speech climate are worth noting. So one is that a large majority of Yale students, some 78%, say that it is at least sometimes okay to shout down a campus speaker they disagree with. More than a third of them believe that using violence to do so is at least sometimes acceptable. We're going to pause there. Yale has been penalized over the last few years, last year in particular, for the outcomes of 8 different speech type controversies. So this is, people shouting down events or disrupting events, attempts at deplatforming, saying so-and-so shouldn't speak on campus because they have a view I disagree with. This includes multiple incidents in which scholars were sanctioned for protected expression as well. Yale students are also some of the least confident in the nation that administrators, despite things like the Woodward Report, will actually stand up for their expressive rights. Yale students also self-censor at pretty high rates, many reporting that they are self-censoring routinely on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. We suspect it's more. It's improving, but at a school like Yale, we really want people to be able to speak up in class. There was one student, a Yale student, who responded to our survey by saying, we know that if professors like you and you agree with them, you're more likely to get that A rather than that A minus. Apparently, this is an open secret at Yale. The university also maintains, again, despite these big pronouncements, that open all of Yale's policy documents and things like Woodward that have been on the books for, decades now, the university also maintains several vague and overbroad policies that can too easily be abused to curb protected speech. Overbroad definitions of harassment and sexual harassment that don't mirror Supreme Court jurisprudence and prevailing Title IX and Title VI standards are among them. If you're an undergrad, there is also an undergraduate regulation that allows Yale's executive committee jurisdiction over, and I quote, any action on the part of students that may, in the judgment of the committee, warrant disciplinary action because those actions may imperil the integrity and values of the Yale community or the well-being of its members. Sounds okay in principle, right? We love well-being, yes. We love, the integrity and values of the Yale community, but how squishy is this standard? That can be employed to punish just about any type of speech you can imagine, and boy, do we see it at FIRE, these types of vague and overbroad standards being used, pulled out in a pinch to say, well, we're gonna make this exception just this one time and punish this student or this faculty member. At a school where you're supposed to be able to say the unsayable and think the unthinkable, well, not really. FIRE has also found interesting correlations when it comes to the pro-Palestinian encampments, which importantly didn't figure in the rankings this year. We sort of took them out of the rankings and said, these encampments are popping up sort of at the last minute. Schools are responding to them in various ways, so we're not going to ding schools or give them credit for their response to encampments. We'll wait till next year when things have calmed down a bit. But some interesting correlations. At more than 110 campuses across the country, we saw these encampments. Yale was among them, but of the schools that had worse free speech climates, students were more likely to be arrested when they participated in an encampment or a similar protest. So this was pretty solid across the board. So some of the data that suggests places where Yale can improve. I like to think of a healthy free speech climate as a multi-slice pie chart where you need a lot of different things, a well-diversified stock portfolio, if you will. Things like institutional neutrality are necessary but not sufficient. Things like good policies that are in line with Woodward-type commitments and First Amendment-type standards, necessary, not sufficient. Putting those policies into practice. So I heard folks at some of the other, at the panel during lunch earlier, I was sitting on my hands going, oh my gosh, I have so much to say. Lots of confusion about, whatever do we do when these protests come up? However can we decide what is protected and what is not? You need really good policies that look like the First Amendment when it comes to free speech, look like the Chicago Statement or the Woodward Report, saying that, we are gonna tolerate the maximal amount of speech, even if it's offensive, uncomfortable, because what we're doing here on this campus, this elite campus, is searching for truth. And if we are putting restrictions on free expression, we're not gonna be able to do that, while also looking to other laws around discriminatory harassment, around sexual harassment, threats, vandalism, and having zero tolerance for stuff like that. Where we see the waters muddied is where administrators do not understand, they are not looking at the prevailing legal definitions. They're kind of making up these definitions as they go or creating squishy ones that can be too easily abused. But if you use the prevailing legal definitions, it helps create a framework in which we can look at the myriad, different ways that free speech or not might show up on a campus and understand, is this free speech? Is this not free speech? Is this in line with what we want to do as a truth-seeking institution? Or is this something that we need to have no tolerance for and there's no place for it in higher education or at our institution? One of the ways in which schools can, and I will leave it at this before we move on to more questions, but one of the ways in which I think schools have gone awry, in which they're lying to themselves, is there's been a bit of an eclipse in terms of what is at the core of the university's mission. So what are we doing here? Are we truth-seeking, or are we doing something else? Are we doing something that looks like, promoting diversity, that sort of thing? A lot of those DEI-type initiatives, which FIRE takes no position on necessarily, have really eclipsed the university's commitment to its core mission. I would argue that without ideological diversity, there can be no real diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think we all feel that, right? A lot of ideas around diversity are very compelling because it's like, we want to treat people as equal. We want to not be, mean to people and treat people differently based on who they are. But at a university, we also want people to be able to show up authentically, bring their values, their views, their background to the table, and we can have these debates in what should be the safest space in the world to talk through these things. And yet, we are seeing faculty, students at Yale saying, I can't say what I actually think, and that is a shame. So one good thing that Yale has going for it is when it comes to rankings, because universities love this ranking stuff, and if they're doing bad in the rankings, they are so mad at us. But if Yale just fixes its 5 overbroad, vague speech codes, it could go up to 29 in the rankings next year, provided, shit doesn't hit the fan with protests and, they're doing bad things. But just those policies alone, all other things being equal, could send Yale up the charts. We hope to see them there next year.
Well, thank you all very much for your initial remarks. You certainly raised a lot of very interesting questions that we'll try to touch on as many of them as possible during the rest of our time together. Now, Ms. Morey, I'll start with a question for you. You mentioned this kind of universal acceptance, or almost universal acceptance, of the idea that it's okay to shout down a speaker if I disagree with them, right? Now what do you think an organization like Buckley that's dedicated to preserving free speech should do in response to this perception? How can we kind of cure it? And a sort of tasteful way to express my disagreement with the speaker, because, you know, as our other panelists said, we do have a right to express, you know, our disagreement and to protest in certain ways. So how should we respond to this?
Yeah, so a little bit of, you know, First Amendment forum analysis, I guess. So like if you're in the open outdoor areas of your campus, for example, that's supposed to be a super free space for you to say basically whatever you want with some limitations. Something like this atmosphere, this, you know, speaking panel where you have invited us here to talk, this is a more limited forum. So we right now have the right to speak. And if somebody comes in and what have we seen over the years at different schools, you know, throws a bag of manure in here, or, you know, tries to chase Keith off the stage, or throws marbles, you know, down the hallway so, you know, we're not, or shouts us down, that is not, you know, their right to speak is not right now. Instead, it's our time to speak. So when there are threats to speakers in these kinds of spaces on campus, we want to make sure that, you know, it doesn't fall to the Buckley Institute or to student groups that maybe are smaller or don't have as many resources to be defending against potentially like a lot of disruptive protesters. What we want is, before students get on campus, ideally, or in their freshman year, we want students to have free speech orientation, or for it to be very clear, for one reason or another, in one way or another, that at no time will Yale accept shout downs. At no time will they accept disruptive protest, while it's also clear that Yale will allow contemporaneous, nearby counter protest, because these are the kinds of First Amendment norms. The First Amendment really loves this. You let the speaker speak, you allow counter protest, you allow op-eds in the Yale Daily News, you allow the most robust amount of debate possible. We also want to see, you know, if there are threats like the threat of disruptive protests, we want to see security on hand, and that security, the cost of those security fees doesn't trickle down to, you know, a student group of 15 students. Instead, Yale or public school, whatever, is going to foot that bill. That's what we like to see. And when it becomes clear to would-be disruptors that they cannot engage in a heckler's veto, a lot of those threats, a lot of those disruptions really cease. It's at the schools where the school, you know, we saw, for example, I'll just give Penn State, for example. At one point in the last few years, Penn State was throwing up its hands, saying, you know, I know we have a $20 billion endowment, but there's just nothing we can do to ensure the security of this, you know, right-leaning comedian who wants to come and speak on campus. Nonsense. When it comes to those kinds of disruptions, there should be police on hand. They should take disruptors out of the crowd so that the main event can go on and so that counter-protests can go on. That's what we like to see.
Yeah, thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense. Now, Professor Christakis and Professor Whittington, this next question is for both of you, and then we'll move on to some audience Q&A. But one thing that's come up a lot over the course of the conference so far is this idea of extramural speech, or things that professors say outside of the classroom. And, you know, we may often think of like social media posts that a professor may make, or political speeches that a professor makes, or something like that that's not directly tied to their academic work, but that, you know, sometimes they will make in their capacity as, say, a Yale professor, right? And that lends some extra credibility to their words. And, you know, critics of unrestrained extramural speech argue that it can be detrimental to the university's reputation, or it can impede classroom learning in some way. How do you think we should regulate things professors say outside of the classroom, or should we regulate it at all?
So I think it's critically important that you have policies in place that provide really pretty extreme protections for faculty to be able to engage in those forms of extramural speech, whether what we're talking about are faculty physically participating in expressive activities on campus, or we're talking about social media posts, or we're talking about podcasts or blog posts or various other kinds of things that faculty routinely do when they express their ideas in a public setting about matters matters of public concern more generally. We do see plenty of universities that adopt policies or have contemplated adopting policies in recent years that would allow university officials to punish faculty for engaging in public speech that the university regards as somehow damaging to the reputation of the university or damaging to the best interest of the university, as it sometimes gets expressed. This is just open season on faculty to be punished for unpopular speech whenever university administrators themselves happen to think that the speech at hand is something that they don't like, or when they're feeling pressure from some kind of stakeholder, whether on campus or off campus, to suppress that speech that they don't like. That the best interest of the university, by the nature of universities, is to allow maximum protection for the ability of members of the campus community to express themselves in public about their own political views, is incompatible with the mission and purposes of a university. For the university to imagine that somehow it's in the best interest of the university to censor what faculty are saying, and to tell them that some ideas are off the table and they're not allowed to discuss them or express them. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the university and what can possibly be in the best interest of the university at the end of the day. And unfortunately, far too many universities are more concerned with public relations than they are concerned with that core mission of making sure that there's space on campus for people to tell the truth as they see it. And the job of the university fundamentally is to stand behind those people and say the university itself may take no position on whether or not those individuals have gotten the right answer on those views, whether or not the university itself agrees with those individuals about their views, but the university's commitment is to making space available and to protect the freedom of those individuals to express those views.
Thank you. Yeah, Professor Christakis.
I have nothing to add to that. I agree with completely.
Okay, excellent.
I think professors should, well, anyway, nothing to add.
Okay. If we could move on to section of audience Q&A, please raise your hand if you have a question, and our volunteers will be right over.
Sure. Thank you, and thanks for the great presentations. My question is, what, if anything, can and should be done about our sprawling campus DEI bureaucracies in order to protect the flourishing of, as Professor Christakis says, of honest, open academic discourse, mindful that these bureaucracies have often succeeded in stigmatizing as punishable microaggressions whole fields of academic inquiry, like disparities in racial groups' achievement other than racism, or social contagions contributing to gender dysphoria. How do we protect that, and how far do you have to go vis-a-vis DEI?
I can start. So again, you know, FIRE has never taken a position on anything other than freedom of expression and that it's good. One of the ways that we have seen DEI bureaucracies impede free expression on campus is because they're so sprawling. I mean, they're part of this larger administrative industrial complex, the corporatization of higher ed, where suddenly colleges are being run less like colleges and more like corporations. It's all interconnected. And a lot of the time, you know, we are hearing from students and faculty who are caught up in bias response teams, who've been hauled into a Title IX investigation because they, you know, I don't know, a faculty member discussed, you know, some sex-related topic that was pedagogically relevant in class, and someone's filing a Title IX report against them, et cetera. And we see some of these, you know, DEI bureaucrats as sometimes like a hammer in search of a nail, you know, on the hunt for violations so that they can, you know, to take the least charitable take here, you know, keep their jobs. Or we've got these bias response apparatuses where if you hear anything not, you know, that constitutes actionable discriminatory harassment under the law, but that upsets you, that offends you, tell us, because then that gives us something to do. That's the subtext there. We have said, you know, that dismantling some of those bureaucracies it can be a good thing. What we don't want to see is the pendulum swingeth too far. So, for example, there have been legislative efforts in some states to work against these, DEI bureaucracies, but they're often too overbroad, and they start saying like, and by the way, you better not teach woke stuff, and by the way, no faculty can teach critical race theory. That sort of thing we don't like to see. So, a scalpel type approach that is centered, with the university's truth-seeking mission at the center. Again, one of the earlier panelists was talking about, like, we really want to, how can we ever support students without suppressing freedom of speech? Well, let me count the ways. You protect protected expression, First Amendment type protected expression, while also offering students all kinds of other support. Does someone have a trauma history around sexual assault? Offer them counseling. Offer them, whatever kind of support, medical support, social support. The university has all kinds of resources at its disposal. What it shouldn't do is, remove the itinerant preacher from campus that might, say like, you're wearing shorts, you deserve rape. That was the itinerant preacher at my state school where I went in Arizona. I recently had someone at the University of Arizona ask me that, how can we, what if a woman who has been raped walks past this itinerant preacher and is triggered? Well, what is going to best support her in the long term? Bubble wrapping her and saying, you're right, you're not ready for the world. You're not ready to go out there and, deal with what the real world has to serve up. You're too weak for that. So we're going to sanitize this campus, but, when you graduate, you're kind of on your own. No, offering support that's going to really get to the root of these kinds of issues is totally within a university's purview. But what they should not do is censor protected expression. All kinds of protected expression is going to trigger all of us at some point. What we want to do is build agency in students and make sure administrators, even DEI administrators, understand that ideological diversity needs to be part of their calculus.
Further questions?
So my question is about something none of you actually mentioned, which is who is giving, say, undergraduate admissions its marching orders? Because who joins this community, right, has a lot to do with the culture of freedom of speech. And I want to put forward a hypothesis, which is maybe Yale admissions is not screening for students who value freedom of speech. If Yale is admitting students, 78% of whom think it is okay to shout down a speaker, and a third of whom think violence toward the speaker is sometimes acceptable. What do you think about what Yale could do or should do institutionally, or is it that we're just all doomed to this because the culture out there has degenerated to that extent?
Well, Harvard started asking that question, so Yale should. Just as a challenge, Harvard just this year started asking that question, but I'll defer to Nick.
I think it's both a problem of admissions and a failure of pedagogy. In principle, most of the kids we admit are pretty smart, and they are teachable. And I think we have abrogated our obligation and our duty to teach them properly, how to think clearly about things, and not merely resort to slogans. So I think part of it is that. But I also agree with you that we are admitting, our heuristics for admitting students are such that we get a draw of kids that aren't ideologically diverse, aren't particularly interested in the kind of learning that was ascendant when I was a student. Not to say that the world can't change. I mean, it doesn't have to be like the world doesn't have to stay the way it was 40 years ago. But, we privilege, for example, activism. We think that's the kind of student we want to admit. And then we're shocked to discover when the students come here, they're not doing the reading, they want A's, and they want to be excused from class to go do their activism. Well, we can't have it both ways. I would prefer for us to admit really nerdy students, but Yale could fill its entire class with #1 students from their high school. That's probably not what we would want. I would love that if they did that. It'd be a great class of students to have for me to teach. But I don't think that's what what we would want anyway. So it's complicated. I think there needs to be a mix. But I agree that we have a problem with admissions in addition to a problem of pedagogy. You'll never find out exactly how this, because there's no transparency about how or why this is done. On the DEI thing, there are at least 54 people at Yale, and probably closer to 100. I think we spend more than $10 million a year, at least, and there'll be no transparency about that either. Just on that.
Any more questions?
Yeah, hello. This question is mainly for Professor Christakis, but Professor Whittington, feel free to chime in. In the hiring and promotion of faculty, especially as someone who received his sterling professorship after like a very public event concerning free speech, do you believe that the university is generally fair and unbiased in hiring people of different ideological backgrounds, or those who may be deemed controversial?
That's such a hard thing. I think, no, I don't think the university is even-handed ideologically in its hiring. Hard to prove that belief. I haven't seen, in all the search committees I've ever been on, I haven't ever seen affirmative discrimination against conservative people. But that may be because they know not to advertise their political beliefs, or their selection of topics for study may avoid that. So I believe my conservative colleagues when they say that to be conservative is to have an extra burden in terms of career advancement, but I think it's difficult to prove that. Did I answer your question? Enough? Yeah. While I have the floor, I just want to take opportunity to pick up a couple of notes. I was waiting for someone to ask this, but I'll say that our harassment rules are really overbroad. And I'm aware of a couple of cases brewing at Yale right now where we explicitly say you can say the unmentionable and think the unthinkable and so on. And immediately when a person does that, this overbroad harassment is hauled out and creates problems for them. And so there are huge loopholes in my judgment, in my view, in that. And on the mission of the university thing, I think this was a mistake. Shortly after the former president of Yale was inaugurated, not long after, in ways that, without faculty review and in ways that are very nebulous, Yale changed its mission, which had always been the preservation, not always, had been for a long time. Our original mission was to train ministers, but that's 300 years ago. But for a long time, our mission was the preservation, production, and transmission of knowledge, which is a great mission, right? Like I really am proud to spend my life on that. Preservation, production, and transmission of knowledge. And the mission was changed with the approval of the corporation, but so far as I know, with no faculty input or any discussion, to improve the world. Now, this now is being used to justify a host of very illiberal policies on our campus. And as the right-wing Congress is applying pressure on our university, people are now saying, well, we're going to do all of these other things because that's our mission. And I have a real problem with this mission. And let me explain, if I can, with an analogy. You would not say, I don't think, that the purpose of the American judicial system is to support capitalism. You would say that the purpose of the American judicial system is to administer justice, ideally impartially, non-corruptly, swiftly, and fairly, right? Now, having an efficient and fair justice system does help capitalism, right? Have you ever tried to do business in a corrupt country? It's difficult. You can't enforce contracts. It's very hard to advance the capitalistic interests when you don't have a non-corrupt and efficient judiciary. But you wouldn't say that the mission of the court system is to advance capitalism. And that's the way I think about the preservation, production, and dissemination of knowledge. That may support in making the world better, improving the world, but that's not our mission. Our mission is not to improve the world. Our mission, in my judgment, is the preservation, production, and dissemination of knowledge. And to the extent that we deviate from that, we open up this huge opportunity for all these other missions, DEI or whatever else, to now get the attention of the university and swerve us away from what we really should be doing, and actually ultimately harm us and make us political targets, which, you know, is happening and will continue to happen so long as we don't commit ourselves to the nonpartisan mission that I would support.
Maybe a final question.
Thankfully, someone else has to pick the final question.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. I'm a first year in Silliman College, and I had a question on the financial side of free speech. We see our neighbors over in Cambridge just reporting a massive drop in donor donations by hundreds of millions of dollars, largely as a result of retribution from their treatment of free speech last year. And I think that we can see similar trends here in New Haven, where with the new chaplain who was just hired, she was essentially forced by the university to apologize for her statement calling Israel a colonialist enterprise. Now, personally, I disagree with her characterization. However, is that not the university acting upon an other person's influence, a donor's influence, in order to censor free speech? And if we look at the other side of things, if it is a donor who is forcing the university to promote free speech, is that necessarily a good thing? Is that not the university promoting free speech from the ideological side, but from the wallet? Should the university not be promoting it out of the good of its heart? Should the university necessarily be scared of the donors, if not in promoting of the values for which it stands?
So universities have an obligation to be able to stand up to donors and others who exert outside pressure, and donors are certainly not the only ones who try to exert pressure on universities to suppress speech. Right? Universities have an obligation to try to defend their mission against those who would wield power against universities to try to get them to deviate from that mission in various ways. And that partially requires the universities be clear-eyed about what exactly their mission is. So what is the scope of free speech, who ought to exercise it, under what kind of circumstances, what kind of rules ought to guide us. And once the university has settled on a set of rules and expectations and practices surrounding what kind of speech ought to be tolerated, what it certainly should not be doing is picking out particular examples of speech and said, oh, well, you said something that we thought was really controversial. You expressed the wrong kind of idea, even though you exercised it within the proper scope of what we otherwise would come to protect. And we should be straightforward about the fact that there are going to be people in the world who are going to want to put pressure on universities to in turn put pressure on members of the campus community not to say certain things. There are donors and others who would prefer that the university suppress some ideas on campus and the expression of certain ideas on campus. And it's hard for universities to resist those pressures. It should be much, much easier for a place like Yale to resist those pressures, right? One of the lovely things about being in a place like Princeton or a place like Yale is it has lots of money. And one of the value of having lots of money is there is some FU money associated with that, in which you can tell a donor who says, I want you to suppress this speech I don't like, and I'm going to withhold some funds from you if you don't do it. You can tell them go jump in the lake because we got a lot of money already, and we can ride this out. And that's what universities fundamentally ought to be doing. There are lots of universities that are not as well positioned, and as a consequence are in a much more difficult position to actually defend speech on their campus, because they cannot so easily say that because there are consequences to turning down money. Right? If you tell a donor, go jump in the lake, we don't want your money, it has some consequences for the scholarly and educational mission of the university as well. Right? And so universities can be in a very difficult position of how do you best advance the mission given those competing and conflicting concerns. And that's a very tough thing to navigate. It's one reason why I do not want to be a university president, because those are hard shoes to fill and you have to make some really difficult choices. But those choices actually ought to be easier if you are a university president of a place like Princeton or Yale than if you're at a lot of other institutions.
Well, if you could please join me in thanking our guests for an excellent conversation.